Uh, we've been talking about genealogies recently. In fact, we've spent the last 2 weeks talking about genealogy because we started with Matthew's account of the birth of Jesus. Now, I don't know about you, but genealogies to me can be boring, especially this genealogy, right? There's just something about it with 51 names thrown at us in about 16 verses of time, and they're all old names. They're from kind of a dead language. They're just not our generation, so they're hard to read. So it gets a little boring to me to kind of read through them. But the thing about a genealogy, if you're like me, you do like learning some things about your past, right? Well, that's what we're doing. We're learning some things about Jesus and his past. And the thing about when you learn things about your past, sometimes you're really surprised. Can you only imagine if you wanted to go home this afternoon, do some genealogical work to discover that maybe Charlie Manson is part of your family? Raise your hand if you tell people about that, right? Like there are times where surprises creep up from our past, and they kind of shock us, and they kind of keep us a little reserved when it comes to sharing about our family history. There are times where some of the shock is a good shock, and it's fun to share, or at least it's enlightening because it reminds you of where you came from. I want to show you a picture we discovered a few years back. This is my grandmother as a child, my mom's mom as a child. She's in a little tub, and it looks really cute, right? It's so sweet. And we learned this little tub she's bathing is right next to a tent. And this happened, I didn't know, and discovered it not that long ago, that it was in a tent where for a year my great-grandparents and her lived during the Great Depression. They were homeless, and they lived in a tent. And those kind of things inspire me, to see where the families come from, and to see what God has done in our lives and moved us around. And so those are the fun things to share, but sometimes you just don't share because it's shocking, or at least it's offensive, or there's things about your past that you kind of want to forget. When we get into Matthew's conversation about the line of Jesus, he does this thing where he starts inserting these names, and they're right because they're part of the lineage, but they're also offensive to the audience at the time. Now Matthew starts this lineage, I told you this, because he's speaking to a really Jewish audience. What that means is these people know that the Messiah is supposed to come through a very specific line. He was supposed to be a line of the great Hebrew king David. If he was not of David's family tree, then he could never be the real Messiah. So Matthew's sharing all of this, trying to prove that Jesus is actually a part of that family line, that he's legitimately a part of the story, and he fits all of the right things. But as he shares, he begins to share other things that are a little more offensive. He shares the people in the family history that are the people you don't always want to talk about, right? He shares the R-rated version of things. He shares the messiness of things. He shares the corruption of the family line. He shares rebellion. This is the family line that's supposed to bring about the Messiah, and yet over and over he brings up names that were completely rebelling against God at various times in their life. And he does this, why? We talked about this last week. Because those stories are the point. Those stories are the point of the big story of why Jesus even showed up. That mankind is in rebellion against God, right? And that we're unable on our own to fulfill or stay faithful to God. And so he's sharing this because this really religious group of people, the Hebrew nation, the Jewish people, had gotten really, really bold in their faith. And when I mean bold in a bad way. They had gotten to the point where they just believed that they were part of God's family because they were so good at how they performed for him. They believed that everything they did for God was why God favored them. And so Matthew, through the leading of the Holy Spirit, keeps including these names because Matthew knows that's not the point of the story. The point of the story is not to just make you a better person. The point of the story is you can't ever be that person, right? And so he's causing us to keep remembering, and he brings up these things so that the people have to face the fact that they're really not that good, that they really do come from a messed up family tree, that they really have been in rebellion against God. And we last week arrived at this one statement, and I'm going to say it again, and we'll put it on the screen, that we arrived at this understanding that your only hope with your standing before God has nothing to do with what you could have ever done. What you did do, what you might have done, what you will do, has nothing to do with that. It has everything to do with what God has done for you. And that's the only accounting in your life that's going to work if you want to have a relationship with God. And that really when we discover this and we start paying attention to the whole genealogy, you know what else comes out? This is great, so don't miss this, because for years I didn't see this. That in the Old Testament, with the law in place, with the Ten Commandments, with all the things that God was doing to reveal himself and reveal how we could not stay faithful to him, in all of that, you know what else he was doing? He was administering grace all along. Grace is not just a New Testament concept, it's all through the Old Testament as well. His grace and mercy is there, and now we can see it in ways that they were missing it, and we probably would have missed it too. But Matthew wants to make sure of this. Look, that your righteousness can't be a platform for your position before God. You just can't ever be good enough. And he's telling and he's accounting this genealogy over and over and over because he wants us to understand that we can't do enough to perform for God. We have to rely on what God's done for us. And really, he's revealing that God, ever since the creation, ever since the garden, he's been inviting mankind into a relationship, to walk with him in relationship, in close relationship. So Matthew's genealogy is opening up this door to us. Now, he's saying to that audience, look, God's always chosen sinners. He's always chosen the unworthy. He's always chosen the rebellious because there is no other kind of person in this world. So we're all in the same boat. So as he tells this genealogy, that's what's happening there in his current day, and that's what should be happening with us today. And we're going to push it a little bit further today. I'm going to take you back to the genealogy, and you're going to be tired of this, or you're going to have it memorized by the time we're done. But go back to Matthew 1, and let's jump into verse 1, and I want to read it one more time. I'll bring you up to speed. And here's how he starts. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob. And Jacob, you remember last week, eventually God changed his name and he became Israel. So if you go back and you read this story, you're going to find that. Don't get confused. Jacob becomes Israel, and Jacob was the father of Judah. And you remember Judah. Judah had 11 other brothers. Judah was one of 12. He wasn't the oldest. He was somewhere in the middle. He wasn't the youngest. The oldest was Reuben. Reuben just kind of fades into the background. Joseph is the one that was really loved by his father Jacob, and he was kind of treated differently, and so his brothers did what? They one day sold him into slavery, right? And I caution you, don't ever do this. If you have siblings, don't sell your siblings into slavery. Just because it's in the Bible doesn't mean you're supposed to do it, right? He says, so Jacob was the father of Judah. Judah had all these brothers, and Judah was the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Remember we talked about Tamar because Tamar actually was Judah's oldest son's wife, and he died because he did evil before God. So as was the custom, Tamar was given to the next brother because she didn't have any kids, and she was going to be left out on her own. So she's given to the next brother in hopes that he will father children and give her a family, and those kids would have been known by the first brother's name, but he didn't do it either. He did evil in the sight of God. And so what happens? Judah sends her off to grieve, catching you up really fast, and he sends her off to grieve, and she kind of feels lost out here because he's not following through on the family promise. And so she takes matters into her own hands. She dresses like a prostitute, again, very different from our culture today, and she puts herself out by the road, and eventually she strikes a deal with Judah, and he sleeps with her, and he has kids by her, and those two boys are in the family line, the genealogy of Jesus. Keep going. And Hezron was the father of Ram, and Ram was the father of Amminadab, and Amminadab was the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon was the father of Salmon, and Salmon was the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. There's where I want to talk this morning. A couple of weeks ago, I told you Rahab has a label. She has a nickname, right? They would have known her, and she's written about in the scriptures as Rahab the harlot. Now, harlot's a really fancy word for prostitute, but that's what they would have called her, Rahab the harlot. And it's a label that she earned of her own accord. And it's a label that it really represents what they did back then, and even we do today. They put labels next to people's names. So in the New Testament, you have John the Good or John the Beloved, right? You have John the Baptist, right? You have Lydia, the maker of purple. You have Uriah the Hittite from the Old Testament. You have all these names with these labels next to them. We do the same thing today, right? You have Alexander the Great, right? You have Conan the Barbarian, Buffy the what? Okay, see, you know these nicknames. That's good, labels. So they're doing the same thing that we tend to still do today. They put a label, and it kind of helps identify that person. And to be fair, Rahab earned this label, okay? This is one that wasn't just poorly assigned to her. She was a harlot. And the question we start to have to ask ourselves is why? Why is she right in the middle of the story of the birth of Jesus? Now, if you've been here for 2 weeks, you're going to go, we got this, Cecil. We know this, right? Because you've been here, you've been paying attention. Because God's reminding us it's not what we've done, right? It's what He's done. So He keeps bringing the messy stories back into the story. You're right. But let's take it a step further today. Let's just stay with me, because I don't want you to check out after that. I want to dig a little bit deeper into Rahab. And so I want to take you to her story, and I want to do that by going to the book of Joshua. Joshua is an Old Testament book that's in the history section of the Bible. So lots of story about what God is doing with His people, how He's revealing Himself. What we're going to do when we pick up this story is we're going to pick it up just after the children of Israel have come out of Egypt. Okay, so what happens? Joseph gets sold into slavery. Eventually his brothers and the family falls into famine. They go to Egypt to buy food. What they don't know is Joseph is now this leader in Egypt, and he's over all the food. So when they go before him. They don't even know him. And eventually what's going to happen is Joseph forgives them, and one of the greatest acts of forgiveness in the Bible, really, other than the cross. And so Joseph forgives them, brings the whole family into Egypt so they can survive, where they last and really stay for 400 years or thereabouts. They grow as a family by the millions. Like, this is large. But as they grow, Egypt forces all the Hebrew people into slavery. They're really the lower rung of society, and they're doing all the hard work, and they're basically slaves. God's been hearing the cries, and He's been telling them that He'll take them back to the promised land one day, and the time arrives, and Moses shows up on the scene. And God's leading Moses to pull the people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. That's where we're picking the story up. And there's a section where you know that probably you've never been to church even, you know that Moses, through the power of God, brings these plagues to the Pharaoh and to Egypt. And right, so here's the list. There's the water turns to blood. There's frogs everywhere, lice, flies. It's just a festival. Livestock has pestilence, boils, hail, locusts, darkness. All of these miracles, these plagues, these things that keep happening so that Pharaoh will get frustrated and finally say, okay, get out of here, get out of here. But the next plague is the one that most of us, if you've never studied this, you might have heard about it. And if you haven't, even if you're a church person, you grew up in the church, the next plague is a hard one. And some of you, it kind of pushes you away from God. I'm going to be honest, you don't know what to do with this. The next plague that finally convinced Pharaoh to let the people go was the night of the first Passover. It was the night when the angel of death went through Egypt and all of the firstborn died in the country. And Pharaoh finally threw up his hands, and he was frustrated, and he told the Israelites, get out. And they quickly gathered their stuff, and there was favor granted to them. In fact, people gave them all kinds of wealth, and they got out. And they started leaving. But as they left, Pharaoh kept flipping his decisions. And Pharaoh finally sent his army after him and said, bring them back. And that's a hard story, because we think, is God just this bloodthirsty God? But I want to remind you of something. You really got to read the story, because as you get through it, what you see is a God who's trying to get Pharaoh to let him go. Not one plague that they recovered from, not 2 plagues they recovered from, not 3, but 9. 9 plagues, and each time Pharaoh's getting closer to letting him go, and you keep thinking he's going to do it, and then he gets mad, and he kind of his heart gets really hard, and he gets stubborn, and he digs in, and he goes, I'm not doing anything. And God said, fine, here it is. And so Pharaoh lets him go, but then he reverses his decision again, and he sends the military after him, and that's when you know the big story. They cross the Red Sea, God parts the waters, and they cross on dry ground. And then, get this, for the next 40 years, they wander around the desert. Now, my family will, in all honesty, tell you, I do good. If I can go 5 hours in a car, you have maxed me out. I can't get past 5 hours. I just don't think anybody should ever be in a car longer than 5 hours. 5 hours will get me to the island in Texas, and I'm good with that, okay? 40 years of wandering in the desert. I got to be honest. I would have probably complained too. The people are complaining, and Moses is getting mad, and there's all of this. God's working with them, but there's just craziness involved in this story, and eventually there's this awareness that the people need God. And they're coming back around, and God says, okay, it's time. I'm going to take you into the promised land finally. And about this time, he says, though, Moses is not going to lead you, and Moses will pass from the scene, and Joshua will be the new leader. And Joshua comes on the scene, and he leads the people across into the promised land. And one of the first things they have to do is they have to take out Jericho. Now listen, so many times, if you're like me, you would love for God to tell you all the little details about your life. Wouldn't that be better? Like if you could see all the decisions that you were going to make and how it would impact your life, it feels better, that it would be easier to serve God if you would just help me know, God, what it is. Write this down, though. I put this in your notes because I think you need to pay attention to this, because in this story, the first thing that we're going to see is God, he doesn't always disclose all those little details. He doesn't always tell you how or why it's going to work out a certain way. You know what he does? He just simply says, I want you to trust me, though. You may not get all the details, but I want you to trust me. Look, maybe something happens this week and you tell a little lie at work. You're trying to cover yourself, or you're covering for somebody else, and you tell a little lie, and maybe you get away with it. Maybe you don't. Maybe in 5 years something else comes back up, and that lie comes back around, and now it invades your life in a way that makes everything miserable. You don't know. God says, I just want you to trust me, and here's how I want you to trust me. I don't want you to lie. You might get away with it. You could get away with it. It might make your situation better. It might not. But God says, I want my people to just trust me, and so don't lie, right? So that we can agree that God is good. But we do these things and we forget all of that, and we don't trust God. The children of Israel are about to have to trust him. Something's going to happen here that's, I think, one of the craziest stories in the Bible. And to start with, Joshua sends 2 spies into the city. He says, I want you to go check out this city. What are we up against here? We've been slaves for 400 years. We're not really army men. We don't know how to fight. This is out of our realm of comfort. But God keeps telling us he's going to give it to us. So go look and tell me what's going on. And the spies go into the city. And as they do, they're ducking and dodging and weaving all through the city. And eventually somebody spots them and tells the king, hey, there's these 2 Hebrew spies. And they're going all over the city, and they're looking at our walls, and they're taking notes on things. And the king says, well, go get them. So they start hauling through the streets, and pretty soon we've got an Indiana Jones movie here. But eventually what they do is they duck into a little house that's built into the wall of the city, because the city walls were 20 feet or more wide. They were built that way so that they would be hard to get through, and they would put little homes in the sides of those walls. They ducked into the home of a lady named Rahab. Now, Rahab's got a home business, but you probably figured that out by now. And as they duck in there and the guards are coming around looking for them, something happens again that just shouldn't happen. The guards don't go in after them. For some reason, the guards stop at the front door. Now, here's how I played this out in my head this week, because I'm thinking, if I was a guard, why didn't I just go get these spies? Go get them. The king told me to go get them. I'm going to go get them. And then I had a thought about my wife, and I thought, oh yeah, later that day, these guards have got to explain to their wives why they were in Rahab's house, possibly. I don't know. I'm just telling you, they didn't go in. They met Rahab at the door, and they said, Rahab, we hear these spies have been here. And Rahab says, you're right, they've been here. But they left. They left because the sun was starting to go down, and when the sun goes down, the city gates are shut, and everybody inside is inside for the night, and everybody outside is outside for the night. And she said, they've gone away. They went away because they wanted to get out of here. They knew the gates were going to be closed. Now, I want to pick it up when Rahab goes up to the roof now, because she satisfied the guards. In fact, she told the guards, go put a posse together and go get them. You'll catch up to them. And they went chasing their tails. And then she goes up on the roof, and she starts talking to the spies. And here's what she says, verse 8. Before the men lay down, she came up to them on the roof, and she said to the men, I know that the Lord has given you the land. Underline that word Lord if you've got a little pen or you're making notes. she uses a word here she shouldn't have used. This is a Canaanite area. They don't worship God. Somehow they've gotten word about him, though. And she uses this word, which was a specifically Jewish Hebrew word. In fact, it was only consonants. It was their special word for God. You will see this sometimes in your Bible. It will look like this, the letters YHWH. It was a word that was never pronounced out loud by the Hebrew people. She said it. We don't even know really how it would have been pronounced because the vowels are gone from it. They never wrote the vowels in this word. This word was so holy to them that they would use a quill to write this word, and then they would retire that quill. It would never write another word ever. So every time they wrote this name for God, they wrote it and they put the pen away, never to use that pen again. The word literally means the existing one. Think about this for just a second. She says to them, the existing one has given you the land. Not my God, not what I've been taught, your God. Keep going. Verse 9. And she said to the men, I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the fear of you has fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land will melt away before you. For we have heard now how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and to Og, whom you devoted to destruction. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no spirit left in us, in any man, because of you. For the Lord your God, look at it, for the Lord your God, he is God in the heavens, above and on the earth beneath. She takes the Lord your God, and she combines that very special word, and she says, I know what I've been taught, but this is not my God. This is not the Canaanite gods. This is not my household idols. It was very custom back then that she would have had little idols in her house that they worshipped as well. They worshipped a plurality of gods. She goes, but your God, the existing one, is the God. And we don't know how. Really, with very little proof text of any kind, what we get is this amazing declaration that she understands who God is. And she's made some kind of change and some kind of shift in her thinking. And she says, we know your God is the God, and he has given all of this to you, and we're scared to death. Verse 12. Now then, please swear to me by the Lord that as I have dealt kindly with you, also you will deal kindly with my father's house, and give me a sure sign that you will save alive my father and mother, my brothers, my sisters, and all who belong to them, and deliver our lives from death. And the men said to her, our life for yours, even to death. If you do not tell this business of ours, then when the Lord gives us the land, we will deal kindly and faithfully with you. And then she takes them to the edge, and she apparently has a rope. I don't know why, but she's got a rope, and it's just long enough to let men down out of her window down to the ground. I'm guessing it sounds like she's done this before. She let the spies go. And what happens next, again, is some of the most epic things in the Bible. Joshua leads the people with the spies, and they talk about how bad it is, and they decide to follow what God has told them to do, because normally you would look at a city like Jericho and you'd think we have to have all kinds of military power and force to take this place. But God says, no, here's what I want you to do. I want you to take the nation of Israel, and you're going to march around the city 6 days in a row. And on the seventh day, you're going to march in total silence, but on the seventh day, you're going to march 7 times. And then the trumpets from the musicians, they're going to blow the trumpets as loud as they can on the 7th time, and then the nation just lets out a scream. And they did it, and the walls fell down. And that's all I can tell you. I don't know how. I don't know why God chose this way. I don't know what's going on, other than God said, I want you to trust me. I know you don't understand all the details. I know this looks impossible, but trust me. Stay with me, and I will do for you what I said. And here's how the story ends with Rahab, verse 22 of Joshua 6. But the 2 men who had spied out the land, Joshua said, go into the prostitute's house and Bring out from there the woman and all who belong to her, as you swore to her. Verse 25. But Rahab the prostitute and her father's household and all belonged to her, Joshua saved alive. Watch this. And she has lived in Israel to this day because she hid the messengers whom Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. She has lived in Israel to this day. Think about that for just a second. She was an outsider. She was a woman. She was a prostitute. The law of God was already in place, right? I mean, the Ten Commandments were there. They knew that sex outside of marriage is not appropriate. They understood the law. She violated the law. These people would have never invited her to be a part of their city, of their community. They were that proud. They were that stuck on what they had done for God. And they were missing something. And God took somebody who didn't belong and brought her into his family. And the beginning of the revelation of the good news is happening, right? That no matter your label, God can overcome that. In fact, this, I don't know if you've ever thought about it this way, but this is the shocking thing to me, that the story of Rahab says the grace of God is bigger than the law of God. That the law of God is set. They understood how they were supposed to behave, and they understood that law was supposed to teach them about the character of God, his holiness, but they grabbed the law of God every time it made sense, and they wanted it to play into their favor. And God says, here's the thing, my grace is bigger than that because you're going to fail me every time when it comes to the law. And he takes somebody who never belonged to the kingdom, never belonged to his people, and he brings her in to show us that his grace is bigger than his law, that his mercy is greater than his judgment. Write this down, that his love will cover all labels. His love will cover all labels. I was reading a book this week and I read a story about Tolkien. If you don't know Tolkien, he wrote Lord of the Rings, and the guy was brilliant in a lot of ways. And I'd never heard this story that Tolkien created his own word when he didn't have a word that he felt like met what he wanted to do in some of his storylines. And so he took the word catastrophe, right, which means devastation, and he took this word catastrophe and he added the prefix on it, EU, which means good. And he put the words together, this eucatastrophe, that out of the darkest moments of life, sometimes there's this light, this ray of hope, the truth breaks through. Rahab is a eucatastrophe. Rahab is this picture of the grace of God breaking through in the moment when you think all is lost. And the question really begins when I think about it. The question I think about is so what kind of label do I have in my life that's kind of defining me more than I want it to, right? Because the amazing thing is in the story, the label might be true. The label might actually be deserved. I might have earned the label in my life by my actions, but while it might declare or describe some things about me, God says, I don't want it to define you. And so he offers his grace to remove it. Not remove it in the sense that nobody would ever call me that. Rahab is called the harlot multiple times in scriptures. The label stuck because it described a portion of her life, and it was important. It described what she had come out of. But while it described her, it didn't have to define her. And the grace of God kicked in. The love of God kicked in. So the question really this morning, as you sit there and you hear the name Rahab the harlot in the lineage of Jesus, and maybe your first thought is, oh man, I wouldn't want that in my family tree. I'm glad we don't have prostitutes in my family tree. I'm glad we don't have cheaters in my family tree. I'm glad we don't have adulterers in my family tree. I'm glad we don't have liars in my family tree. I'm glad we don't have dummies in my family tree. Whatever the label is God asking you possibly this morning is have you held on to a label? You know, if we could get really intimate, if we could offer up our hearts this morning, if we peeled back the layers and began to look at our thoughts, the things that we wouldn't want anybody else to know about. If we could peel back our lives from the previous week or previous year and see some of the actions that we did outside of, our Christian brothers and sisters, or outside of the good people, but we got caught in a situation, or maybe we were alone in our car and we yelled at somebody because they cut them off in traffic. If you ever see me yelling, just remind me that I'm wrong. What's the label that's while it describes a portion of your life, maybe it describes something you've had in your life, that it's still defining you, and you need to begin to learn to trust the grace of God and let him take that label away so that it doesn't define you. Are you even willing to go there with God? Can you trust him with those labels? I know the holiday season's not always the nicest for some of us. We have family memories and things that we'd rather not dig up. And to be honest, if God was sitting with you right now and you could look at him face to face, because he is here, but if you could see him face to face and he asked you, are you willing to let that label go? How would you respond? Sometimes we hold on to labels because it just feels good. It feels like it kind of, it not just defines us, but it kind of gives us a cause for our actions or the way we treat others, or it gives us our reason for the way we're going to be the way we're going to be today. What's your label? Will you be honest before God this morning? Will you let him take it away? Will you let him work with you on it? Will you let him show how much greater his grace is? Will you pray with me?